It's Pamela, Private Eye. You want to know what it feels like to sit across from a self-made millionaire who had the world by the tail and then in an instant loses it and is now facing the death penalty, capital murder, for stabbing his young, beautiful trophy wife in the neck with a screwdriver? You will not believe how he got to this place, how he ended up using a screwdriver as the weapon. This guy had 0 criminal charges prior to this. I had more of a record with my traffic tickets and is now facing the death penalty. I want you to listen to this and tell me what you think. Did we get justice on this case? Is there such a thing as justice on this case, on something like this? Don't tell me what you thought prior to this about the death penalty. I want you to listen to this one and tell me what you think, because this was pretty life-changing for me. Check it out, PamelaPrivateEye.com. The episode is Sorry, Charlie. Welcome to Pamela Private Eye. Today we're going to be talking about a capital murder case. I call it Sorry Charlie because Charlie was about the sorriest client that I'd ever had. I'm here today with the amazing and talented Richard Casper, who's one of the best lawyers I have ever worked with.
Hello.
And my friend Shelley.
Hi, Pamela.
Good to be with you.
Charlie was the first capital murder case that I had. And capital murder, when I talk about capital, that means that someone is facing the death penalty for their charge. So there's no question that Charlie did the murder, that he committed the crime. Charlie is going through a divorce and he stabbed his younger, beautiful trophy wife in the neck with a screwdriver in front of the courthouse.
Oh, no!
I remember that from the newspaper. That was a brutal murder.
Brutal. No question he did it because he was in front of the courthouse.
Where were the police?
As I remember, didn't one of the bailiffs from the courthouse pull Charlie off, the victim?
Yep, exactly. So, yeah, there's no way to wiggle around.
When you say no way to wiggle around, what do you mean wiggle around guilt or innocence?
Well, there's no question he did it. He's the guy. So, there's no mystery about who did it. We know Charlie did it. But just wait until you hear why he used a screwdriver as the murder weapon. It's also really fascinating what happened at the end. This is a really interesting case.
So we're going to presume this guy guilty, right?
Yes.
Okay.
He is guilty of murder. I knew he was guilty.
If he's presumed guilty, then what is it that you're trying to help him with?
90% of my clients are guilty. So this is one of the cases where my client's guilty. He killed her. So in this case, my job is just to make sure that justice happens.
Gotcha. Okay.
He was facing the death penalty, and this case created a real dilemma for me because I believe in the death penalty.
I do too.
And especially in a case where clearly he did it, no question. And I had seen it on the news, and I had the thought, I would hate to be the person that had to defend that case. Literally, the next morning, I get a phone call from his lawyer, who is one of the prominent defense lawyers in the state. The reason he was one of the lawyers on the case is because there are only a handful of lawyers that are qualified to defend capital murder cases. So he's one of those that are in that elite class. And Charlie was wealthy, so he could afford him. He's like a character out of a book. Jack is really passionate. He's very intense. I've worked with Jack for a very long time, and I loved it and I hated it. Man, there were times like walking into a courtroom with Jack. It really was an honor. When he walked in a courtroom, he owned that courtroom very often. The judges would defer to him about law. And when we'd walk in the room, if I stayed in the back where the people were, I could hear people whisper and say like, hey, there's Jack. That guy is the preeminent defense lawyer. Not only was he really, really intense, like there were times I had meetings in his office, just sitting across the desk from him and going through a case and telling him information that he didn't like hearing. And he would get really frustrated, like if we were in a bad spot on a case or we just got some news that our client was guilty and now we had to figure what else we're going to do, take a plea or what we were going to do. And Jack would get so upset. At least 2 different occasions when Jack got so angry that he threw a pen across his desk.
At you?
At me. Now, he was an athlete in his day, and I was only 6 feet away from him, so I'm sure if he wanted to hit me, he could have. But the fact that he threw the pen at me was intense. Like, who does that?
Oh, yeah, I don't like that.
Like, no one does that. But he would also go from being like that intense kind of crazy guy where he would yell and swear a lot. He would swear, oh man, I don't know who swore more, Jack or the clients. Probably Jack. And there were so many days that he would be so intense like that, and I would leave his office crying, get in my car and cry all the way home and wonder, why am I doing this? Why do I do this work? Then there are other days, because the opposite of that, like he's really intense and kind of almost scary to me. His anger scared me at times. But he took that emotion and that passion to make himself into a really good lawyer. Like his cross-examination, that guy, there was no one better at cross-exam. Oh man, he was good with the witness.
What makes a lawyer good at cross-examination?
Man, he was really quick on his feet, could really get a feel for a witness and where they were weak, and then go right after it and expose that weakness. In criminal defense work, those witnesses are very often police officers or federal agents.
If he was that aggressive, was there a love-hate relationship between Jack and the police officers?
I think we were short on the love part of it. It was mostly a hate relationship. I don't think they liked him, they respected him. He was also incredibly charming when he wanted to be. I remember one time going into court, we were appearing in front of a female judge who had a reputation for being brutal. She was a tyrant, and criminal court, sadly, is always packed full of people. And I was sitting in the back waiting for our client's turn to go in front. I'm watching this woman, the judge, just go after these defense lawyers, just attacking them and their clients. Like, she is going after their client like crazy. She's sending one guy after another to jail. Oh, you violated this? You're going to jail. You're going to jail. And I just thought, oh man, it's going to be an intense day for our client. He's probably going to jail. And then Jack gets up there. And the second Jack walks up, because he's such an intense guy, he's either like really hated or really loved by people. And with her personality, I just assumed maybe she wouldn't love him. And he walked up to the podium. Oh my gosh, she loved him. She was like, oh, Jack, I haven't seen you for so long. It's so good to see you. And they're talking a minute, and they start talking about our case. The defendant goes up and is standing next to him, and she says, oh, Jack, you seem so much happier than you used to be. And I was really surprised by this, because he was the same kind of cantankerous, grouchy guy I'd been used to dealing with. And so I was really surprised, like, what? And she says, yeah, like, you seem so happy now. What's different about you? And the whole courtroom just went silent, and everyone's just listening to hear, like, what Jack says changed him. And he said, well, I found Jesus, Your Honor. and everyone laughed. And I knew he was already a religious guy, so that didn't really surprise me. But then he said, yeah, I found him, and you know what? He was behind the couch the whole time. And the courtroom just busted up laughing. When he wanted to be, he could be really charming. And that particular joke was actually really funny to me, because I think almost every client I have, when they go to jail, they find Jesus. And I've joked that Jesus must live in jail because everyone finds him when they're in there. They start reading the Bible, they all find Jesus. I always joke that they must leave him in jail when they leave, because then they leave and they go back to their old behaviors.
So what do you do when you know your client's guilty? I mean, what's your job then?
In this case, it was very specific. There were 2 investigators on this case, and on the defense side. The other guy was doing the actual crime side of it, which I thought was silly, because we knew Charlie did it. Like, what is there to investigate?
Well, doesn't the nature of the crime have something to do with whether they impose the death penalty? If it's a particularly brutal crime, isn't it more likely?
It is more likely, and there have to be 2 crimes connected for it to qualify for the death penalty.
Tell me what you mean by that. 2 crimes.
2 charges. It can't just be murder. Like, they have to have, like, murder and a weapon, or murder and assault,
So what were the charges against Charlie?
They were murder and assault. No, it started out as attempted because she lived for a few days, and as soon as she died, then they changed it to capital murder.
So she lived long enough for them to change the charge?
Yeah,
Wow, how long did she live?
just a few days, but she was,
Oh, really?
they said she was brain dead, and her family chose to pull the plug.
Oh, wow.
So, like I say, I had thought, I don't know how anyone could do this case, and I'm glad it's not me defending it. And then I was put in a position where I was asked to defend it. And my job was to investigate whether there was any reason that Charlie should not be executed.
What kind of reasons are you looking for?
That's what I didn't know. I'd never done this before. It was my first capital murder case. And Jack does not even believe in the death penalty for anyone. And he and I disagree on that. I think there are cases where the death penalty is justified. And here I was, it was like the biggest case in the state at that time, which is a huge opportunity. I wanted to do well with my career. This would help my career. But I had the moral dilemma. Do I investigate to defend this guy? And I went through a pretty extensive process. Like, do I sit next to a guy that's done this? How does this all work? Who am I? How do I fit in this? Ultimately, what I decided about me was I do believe in our justice system. And for me to investigate whether Charlie should be executed or not, it's just me putting the facts together. I don't change the facts. It's my job to find the evidence, to find the facts. And I decided that that was the right thing for me to do. So I took the case. So I was also really fascinated with my background in psychology. I thought he deserved the death penalty, but I was also fascinated to be able to sit down with this guy and find out, man, how did you get to this place?
What's got to be particularly interesting to a woman, knowing the difference in strength and potential violence between men and women. And a woman is more likely to be a victim of male violence than a perpetrator of violence against men. So that must have had some personal meaning for you too.
Oh, absolutely.
If it's capital murder, does it go to a jury or is this decided by the judge?
It depends on the defendant. They get to choose if they want a bench trial, which is the judge would rule on the case, or a jury trial. Charlie was in the county jail. I drove to the jail, checked in to see him like I'd check in to see all my clients. And I'd never been to this section of the jail before. I've been to jail so many times with so many clients. I know the jail like the back of my hand. And I'd never been to this section.
What section is it? What is it called?
They send me to the health service section, and so I thought maybe, I said, is he sick, or is this, what is this? I had heard that he had attempted suicide while she was still alive, and then right after she passed away, he was in custody the whole time.
So did that turn out to be true? Was it because of an attempted suicide?
Yeah. So when someone is suicidal, some jails handle it different ways. Some will just put them on suicide watch, and supposedly the guards watch more carefully. This particular jail has a different section of the jail, so inmates that are ill, that need special attention, or suicidal, either mental or physical help, they're in the health service section.
Wow, isn't that some irony? We're going to keep this guy alive so we can kill him.
It almost makes me laugh.
Yeah, that's weird.
Because they work so hard to protect someone from killing themselves. Like, hey, we don't want you to kill you, we want to kill you. You can't do it, we want to do it. It's barbaric and awful. And so I get to the health service section of the jail, and the guard brings Charlie to me. I was anxious to see what he looked like, and to actually look him in the eye and get
What did he look like?
Charlie was in his 50s, but he looked older than that. He looked like he was in his 60s. I think he'd lived pretty hard.
Tall, short?
5'11", pretty trim. He was really not a very attractive man. He was balding, mostly bald, and he had really dated eyeglasses. I don't think fashion was really important to him. And he had pretty crooked teeth. But other than that, he was fine. He was an average-looking guy.
Ah, so what was it about this guy that attracted the younger trophy wife? Let me guess.
Money.
Yeah, Charlie had a lot of money. Charlie was a self-made millionaire. There were some things about Charlie that I learned through the process. Mind you, I started the first of this investigation being fine with him being executed. My job was to figure out, is there any reason we shouldn't execute him? And so I start investigating, And what I learned about Charlie was, with a high school education, he'd become project manager at the second largest construction company in the world, over like 1,000 employees, of which most of them were engineers.
So what does the prosecution have to prove in order to get Charlie on death row?
Well, ordinarily it's a guy who has, and I say guy because it's always men that have been facing the death penalty in Utah. It's a guy that has a criminal record. He's got a long criminal history.
And usually with violence, I presume.
Exactly. But in Charlie's case, he had no criminal record. I'm not even kidding. Like, I had more of a criminal record than Charlie because I had speeding tickets. Charlie he'd never even had a speeding ticket in his life.
Wow.
So if you've got a guy with a clean record, what does the prosecution have to prove in order to get Charlie on death row?
They have to show that what he did was a particularly heinous or violent, depraved act. And the crime, the way he killed her, was depraved and abusive. That it was serious physical abuse or serious bodily injury. By using the screwdriver on her and stabbing her in the neck, that fit the definition of serious bodily injury.
So I don't mean to get too graphic here, but I guess that's what the prosecution would try to prove to a jury. Now, this is a jury question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The death penalty. So the prosecution has to prove to a jury by unanimous decision that this act was depraved or particularly heinous.
Exactly. And I didn't think they would have a hard time proving that.
A screwdriver to the neck.
It's just horrific.
Yeah, that sounds like it might work for them.
Right. So Charlie went literally from 0 to 100. Nothing on his record.
Was there any background of him having any kind of abuse towards her before this?
No domestic violence. They had no phone calls of domestic violence between him and her. There's no record of any of that with him. He literally went from 0 to 100. Like, you do nothing and now we're talking about executing you.
Wow.
Well, it sounds like this is pretty much a slam dunk for the prosecution. I mean, you've got no question about his basic guilt. And I think most people would say that method of murder was particularly heinous. That's
Absolutely.
unusual.
So I start investigating. I meet Charlie, and he tells me about who he is and his background. And Charlie had been divorced once before. In that divorce, Charlie lost half of everything. He'd worked pretty hard up to that point. And she said, I'm going to take you for all you've got. And she took half of his stuff, and he lost his house. So Charlie thought, I think a lot of men think that their marriage is fine if they don't hear about it.
Oh, I agree.
And with his working for the second largest construction company in the world, he traveled a lot. They would do really big projects. So Charlie would be gone for 3 weeks at a time, 4 weeks at a time, and then he'd come home for 2. And then he'd be gone for 3 and come home for 2. So he was gone a lot, and they didn't have children together. He was a little older. So she did things to make herself busy. And at one point she said she wanted to learn how to drive a motorcycle. And Charlie was like, great, go buy a motorcycle. So she went and bought a $6,000 motorcycle. Then he was out working, done a job. He gets a phone call. She tells him that she loves riding motorcycles so much that she'd like to get a better motorcycle. She wants a Harley Davidson. And he was like, great, let's go buy 2. We'll get one for you and for me. And that was something they would do together.
Oh, cool.
And that becomes an issue a little bit later. Charlie, in that first meeting with him, he expressed this incredible remorse. I have never seen anyone more sorry in my life. Any other client people often think that the defendant wins. Like, oh, they killed this woman and somehow that it's a win for them. What I see in the criminal system is it's a lose-lose. Charlie lost it and killed his young, beautiful trophy wife. And he felt so horrible about what he did. He had already attempted suicide once before. As soon as he heard that she had died, when he was in jail and he heard she was gone, he was going to hang himself with some sheets in the jail. Here's what's funny, like ironic funny to me. This guy's facing the death penalty, so the guards go get these beanbag things that they shoot him with to knock him down, because he hadn't stepped off to hang himself. But to get him down, they shoot him with these beanbags to make him stop so he doesn't kill himself, because, like we mentioned earlier, you can't kill you, we want to kill you.
Uh-huh.
It's just so crazy bizarre. So meeting Charlie, we talked about his work, how much he was gone, but one of the first things he said to me was, I don't want to live with what I've done. I have killed my princess. She was my princess. And I was thinking, man, really? Because I never heard a princess story where she got stabbed in the neck with a screwdriver at the end. Like, that's not how you treat a princess.
That's crazy.
And he's telling me, I just want to die. I can't live with what I've done. And I said, well, man, you hired the wrong damn defense lawyer. Your lawyer doesn't even believe in the death penalty. And he said, please tell him, please go back and tell him when you talk to him that I want to be executed. I want to die. And I would go back and tell Jack. And he would tell me, no, he doesn't. They all say that, but he doesn't mean it. And I would laugh like, yeah, but they all might say it. But Charlie's actually attempting it. He's attempted it in jail. He's on suicide watch. I think we can take his pleas very seriously here. But that wasn't my job. My job was just to investigate, was there anything redeeming about Charlie? So I started investigating all of that. What I learned is Charlie thought his marriage was good. He thought things were fine. And he came home from a work trip and was excited to be home, and she came and told him, I want a divorce, and I don't love you anymore, I don't want to be with you, and I'm going to take you for everything you've got.
No.
Well, that was a huge trigger for Charlie. He had been through that before, and he'd lost most of what he'd built up to that point. And now, he really had quite a lot to lose. He and she had a house that was worth just under $1 million. He had 3 rental properties in Texas that the income on those properties were like in the tens of thousands every month. He had a big stock portfolio, retirement portfolio, and he was making like $250,000 a year on his salary. So he had a lot to lose. But that wasn't even his focus. He thought, okay, I'm not home enough. He said, I quit my job immediately. The second she said she wanted a divorce, I sat down at my computer, I wrote my letter of resignation to my boss. Now, when a client tells me this, I don't just take their word for it. I verify. So I called his boss, and his boss confirmed, yeah. Charlie sent me a letter of resignation, said that his wife was wanting a divorce, and we didn't want to lose him as an employee. So he said, I responded and said, Charlie, you take whatever time you need. We don't want to lose you. You take care of your marriage, and then when you're done, you come back and we have work for you. And I interviewed his coworkers, and man, he had engineers that worked for him that said, Charlie taught me everything I know.
Does any of this matter?
I think it mattered. Initially, I wondered the same thing.
It doesn't change at all the way in which he killed her.
It doesn't.
And that's the issue, isn't it?
The only issue that we had any wiggle room to try to help or not was, should this guy be executed or not? And that's what I was trying to find out. Should he? Was there any reason not to execute him?
Well, wait a minute. This was a crime of passion, right?
Right.
I mean, we've got this man who, in all respects, except for 15 minutes in his life, he's living this ideal model life. And for 15 minutes, he's detached and he loses all right to live.
Wow.
That sounds like insanity. Does
You know,
that apply here?
And, we didn't seek out the doctor. The bailiff pulled Charlie off of her when he was attacking her. And apparently Charlie had gotten hurt also and in that fight. And so Charlie and she were both in the hospital. And the emergency room doctor actually contacted us and said, hey, in my career as an ER doctor, I have never seen any case that was temporary insanity like this one.
You're kidding.
If you need a doctor to testify that he was temporarily insane, he was temporarily insane. I saw him immediately after the fact. That guy was irrational. That was not normal.
Wow, that's impactful. For a doctor to be able to say something like that.
It was interesting, like that first meeting with Charlie at the jail. I finished meeting him, and those meetings are like, it's cold. Every part of the jail, like it's just steel and cement. The jail is just such a cold environment, and I'm not suggesting that it should be warm and happy. Like even the stool that I would sit on in that, I remember in the health service section, it was just like this metal bar that was like cemented into the ground, and then this flat piece of metal that you sit on. There was a lot to learn about Charlie, so that I would sit on that awful steel stool for hours. Charlie got so lost in explaining to me his life. He traveled all over the world for his work. He would go to Costa Rica and build, and go to Costa Rica and scuba dive. They loved to scuba dive. And he flew her to Maine just to surprise her and go eat lobster. Like, they lived really big, bigger than most people, and they lived really well.
So does any of that matter?
No, I mean, it does, but it doesn't. That part didn't matter so much to me as his character. And I in my first meeting with Charlie at the end, we'd been talking for a while, and I said, okay, Charlie, I'm going to go be calling some of the people that worked with you. I'm going to be verifying all these things and investigating, see what I can learn. And Charlie bent down, and he said, oh, isn't that amazing? I said, what? He said, Gal, you know what? I'm so used to doing business and having a briefcase that I forgot for a minute that I'm in jail, and I reached down for my briefcase because I would always have that in a meeting. And he said, for just a moment, I forgot where I was. And it was just kind of this moment that I was like, wow, this guy carried a briefcase and now he's in here for capital murder. It was just that's not usually what I see. So I'm in the middle of the investigation. I was playing this really posh gig up in Park City for the mortgage lending guys, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Really expensive. They spent a fortune on it. And I was thinking that, this must be the kind of stuff, conventions and meetings that Charlie would come to. And then we had a break. We go back on stage. We play a couple songs. And in between songs, this guy yells up to the stage like, Margaritaville. And, great, yeah. So we kick in and we're performing Margaritaville. And as I get to the line, smell those shrimp beginning to boil, it just took me back because I just a few hours earlier been in jail with Charlie, and he was telling me how he flew his wife to Maine to go eat lobster. And they scuba diving in Costa Rica, and I could see him on the porch with her, and they're having this great life and playing Jimmy Buffett music, and the shrimp is boiling on the stove. And how far he came from that world to where he was in jail, where the food, I haven't eaten the jail food, but I hear that's one of the worst parts of being in jail. They hate it. And Charlie kept saying, hey, my life was really big. I had a really high quality of life, and this is not how I want to live. This is no life for me. I want to end it. And I kept telling his lawyer, and he would say no.
What did you keep telling his lawyer?
Hey, Charlie wants to die, right? He wants to be executed.
But that didn't make any difference to this lawyer because he was opposed to the death penalty as a matter of conscience.
Right. He thought no one deserved to be executed. And so he's like, you just keep doing what you do.
And he put in his resignation to the company. What was the time frame from the resignation to the death?
She didn't care if he'd put his resignation in or not. It was too late for her. She's like, I'm done. Mostly because she'd found someone else.
Oh, okay.
But from the time that she told Charlie, I'm done, from that time until the murder, about 1 week. As I was investigating, I learned a lot of things. In that first bit of time, as soon as his family decided to pull the plug on her because she wasn't going to live well, she was brain dead. As soon as they decided to pull the plug on her, they were furious, and that's understandable. I am not justifying any of this that Charlie did. But the minute they did that, they decided to file a wrongful death suit against Charlie. Well, of course, he's going to lose that because he's the reason that she's not alive. They file a lawsuit against him.
The family is saying, okay, now we want compensation. And he's like, you don't have to sue me. I will give you everything. Does that usually happen in a civil lawsuit? Is that what a civil lawsuit is I want you to pay for what happened?
Yes, exactly. Like in the O.J. Simpson case, because O.J. was acquitted on the murder, and so the only recourse they had was to go after O.J. in civil court. In Criminal court, he has to be found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. In civil court, he only has to be found at preponderance of evidence. So he was found guilty in civil court. So, like OJ's case, the victim's family only had to prove that it was more likely than not that Charlie or OJ was responsible for her death. And there were some things about Charlie's character that I started to really gain some real respect for him. He knew what he'd done was wrong. He said, I don't want to fight it. There's no point in fighting that. You don't need to sue me. I will just give you everything I have. And when he said that, he had a lot to give. The home they were living in that was about $1 million, those properties in Texas, his retirement account, like he had a lot to lose. And he just signed it all over to them. In fact, the defense, we were paid out of that estate.
When you're investigating and you're in the prison, does Jack ever come in with you? So when you were telling him Charlie wants to die and he's like, no, he doesn't. Did Jack ever communicate with him separately? Did he ever have a conversation with him?
So rarely. The only time Jack would meet with a client, typically, he would only see them in court. So if we had a hearing, Jack would meet with the client right before.
But he left the one-on-one conversations with you.
Yep. When this happened, as soon as she told him she wanted a divorce, Charlie couldn't sleep again. He didn't have a full night's sleep from that moment on, but he was exhausted. And she was concerned enough about that, apparently, that she took him to a doctor so they could get him some sleeping pills, thinking that would help him rest and she could get on with her life. So he was taking the sleeping pills, but he wasn't sleeping. He still couldn't sleep, so he was really altered. One of the other areas that I was really impressed with Charlie, that he had a high school education and was able to create a life for himself where he had such great skills that he was so valued that he was overseeing 1,000 employees underneath him, of which most of them were more educated than he.
Wow.
I was impressed by that. And he'd learned how to manage money very well. Oh, he was a voracious reader. Charlie said he'd read everything they had to read in the jail library as we were going through this process, and would ask me to buy books for the jail so he'd have more to read. That was the only piece that he found. And so Charlie hadn't been sleeping, and he was so distraught over this. I think he thought when he told her, hey, I will stop, I won't work, I'll quit, I'll resign right now and just be with you. Of course, he was hopeful that she'd say, great, let's do it, but she didn't. I later learned because she had found a new boyfriend.
Wow.
But that's beside the point. That's all done now. And that certainly doesn't justify his killing her. He didn't know that initially. So she moves out of the house. She filed for a protective order. Charlie filed for it. And they didn't have a kid, and there were no allegations of, there were no phone calls, there was no domestic charge against him or her, but they both filed a protective order of the house to get custody of the house and to keep the other person away from the house. And there was one time, just before the protective order was filed, that she called Charlie and asked him, she said, let's get together, let's go ride our motorcycles, let's get on our Harleys and we'll go for a ride like the olden days and let's just talk. And Charlie was so excited. He was so hopeful. He gets on his Harley and goes to the meeting place where he's supposed to meet her. And he waits and waits and waits. He waits like an hour. And calls her, she doesn't answer. He calls again, she doesn't answer. He gets a little worried. And then he thought, you know what, she probably just changed her mind. She didn't want to see me. Maybe she'll call me later. So he drives home. And just as he's coming down the lane to his house, he sees her like pulling out in the SUV that he paid for her. Everything she had, he'd gotten for her. And she comes peeling down the lane with dust flying behind her SUV. And he knows, like, wow, I just got played.
Oh, no.
She wasn't trying to meet me. She was just playing me. She just screwed me over so she could go in the house and take stuff.
Yeah, that's not right.
So he rushes in the house, and sure enough, she had just ransacked the place, stole everything she could grab as fast as she could. And I mean, she stole, her things, that's one thing to take her things, but she started crossing over and taking things that were valuable to him.
No.
And she even took a picture of him fishing with his dad that I don't even know what meaning she would have, reason for taking that. but it really hurt him.
So this goes back to some of your private eye tips.
Exactly.
Be really careful when you're pushing, because you know how to push each other's buttons.
Exactly. So he filed for a protective order of the house. Her divorce lawyer filed for a protective order. They were both fighting over stuff. Just stupid stuff, because that's all it is. And the morning of the murder, Charlie hadn't slept. He hadn't been sleeping well. His secretary calls him, even though he'd resigned. They needed help on a job site that they were on, that Charlie had the information on. And when I interviewed her, she said, I knew Charlie didn't drink, but if I had to guess, I would have thought he was drinking that morning because his speech was slurred. It wasn't the Charlie that I knew.
Maybe he'd been taking the sleeping pills.
He'd been taking the sleeping pills, trying to sleep, but unable to sleep. And it had been days of this. So absolutely, he was altered. He was in an altered state.
Sometimes we say diminished capacity.
For sure, he was at a diminished capacity. His lawyer said, meet me at the courthouse. The judge just signed the order. Charlie drives to the courthouse, and the protective order that both Charlie was seeking and she was seeking to get custody of the house, the judge signed her order. Not only did he sign her order, which meant that Charlie would have to move out of his home, their home together, but Charlie would have to move out of the home. She would have custody of the home. The judge, this was a temporary order. This was the first order in their divorce. It also had the protective order, so Charlie wasn't supposed to be around her, within like 100 feet of her. And it gave her the income from the rental properties in Texas. And it also gave her 2/3 of his salary.
Wow.
Which I couldn't understand. Even why would that be? That made no sense to me.
It doesn't make sense.
And his lawyer thought the same thing, his divorce lawyer. So Charlie said, as he comes out of court, he's furious. Of course, who wouldn't be? You just get kicked out of your house. She was, I'm sure, going to be excited to be getting the house. And his lawyer said, he knew Charlie was freaking out and upset. And his lawyer said, Charlie, don't worry about it. This is just the first battle. We'll keep coming at it. We'll reverse this. And Charlie was so furious. Charlie was absolutely inconsolable, totally distraught.
Right.
His lawyer's trying to say, Charlie, trying to stop him as he leaves.
So you got this information from his divorce lawyer?
Yes.
That he was distraught?
Yes. Confirmed with what Charlie says also. Charlie leaves in a fury. He's so angry, so upset. He leaves the courthouse. Charlie notices her SUV in the parking lot and sees that there are items in the back, and he is convinced that these are the things that were stolen from his home, and he is furious.
Right.
Apparently, she's there with her lawyer to see the same court order for her to learn, hey, I won. I won the protective order. He jumps in his truck, takes off. He doesn't want to go home. He's just driving around, just too mad to go home, doesn't know where to go. Drives around, and he decides, you know what? I'm going to go back. My lawyer's right. Let's appeal this. Let's fight this. This is just the first battle. I'm not going to let him take everything I've worked for. So he drives back to the courthouse, but he decides, hey, while her car's parked there, he just passed a hardware store. So he thought, I'm going to go back, buy a screwdriver, and the back of the SUV had a hatchback, and he thought, I know all that stuff she just stole from me from the house is in their SUV. I bought that damn car. I'm just going to go pop the back open. I don't care if I break that hatchback. I'm just going to go pop it open and grab my stuff back while she's in there.
And take his stuff.
So he goes to the hardware store, buys a screwdriver, comes back. Now, that was a troubling part of the case, that he bought the screwdriver right beforehand, because they thought that he bought it with the intent to stab her. I really do believe Charlie when he said that his intent was to get his stuff out of the car. So as he comes back to the courthouse, she's already found out what she needs to learn, and she's walking out of the courthouse. She's coming out the courthouse steps, and now he doesn't know what to do. This changes his plan. He can't go try to pop the back of the SUV open while she's right there. He sees her, she sees him. She goes and gets in the SUV. He stops his car, and we know his truck is parked. And where she comes driving, he swore to me that she was coming out of the courthouse and saw him, that she looked at him, flips him off, and mouths to him, "I told you so."
So once again, your private eye tip, pushing the buttons.
And in his world, everything, he just freaks out. Like, this is exactly what I was afraid of. She's going to take everything I've got. The judge has now done it. And this is when he loses it. He says the last thing he remembers is her SUV came driving along in front of where his truck was parked on the street, perpendicular to where his vehicle was. The last thing he remembered, he said, was hitting the gas. What we know is he hit the accelerator so hard, so fast. He was just gunning it. When he hit her SUV, he hit it with such force.
He hit it broadside.
He hit it broadside, and he hit it with such force broadside that it knocked the SUV on its side. Then he grabbed a screwdriver. Now, Charlie said he had no memory of this. I almost wouldn't believe that if I hadn't had the statement from the ER doctor saying that this guy was insane. He'd never seen anything like it.
When you're going through a crisis like this, you're not sane. You're tipping over on crazy whether you want the divorce or not, or there's a death or whatever. You know what I mean? You're not your normal self.
He grabs the screwdriver, climbs in her vehicle, and then starts stabbing her. When the bailiff gets word and comes out and gets Charlie off of her. Like I said, I have never had a client who was more remorseful and more sorry than Charlie was. Every time I saw Charlie, we'd go through the case and then he'd tell me, "I don't know why you're doing all of this. I want to be executed. Why are you working so hard on this?" And I'd explain, "Charlie, every time I'd tell him, you have the wrong damn lawyer if you want to be executed. Your lawyer doesn't even believe in the death penalty." And one day, after I'd gotten to know Charlie pretty well, and through him and through the people he worked with and in his life, and I really started to have some real respect for where he was in life, not for what he did, but the life that he had created up to that point. And I was checking in the jail, and it was just weird, like something was off. And when I asked, "Hey, I'm here to see Charlie," everything, it was just all different. And when they called the guards to say, "We have a professional visit here for Charlie, can you," the whole conversation, everything was different. And I thought they were going to tell me I couldn't see him, like, "You're going to have to come back," but they didn't. So I get in there to the health service division, and they brought Charlie into me. Now remember, he wore glasses. He was always in his jail uniform when they'd bring him to me, but they didn't usually bring him handcuffed to me. But this time he was handcuffed and shackled, meaning that they had shackles like on his feet and chains that like go around his waist, that the handcuffs tie to their waist so their hands can't move very much. And this hadn't happened before. And he didn't have glasses on. I thought, oh no. And I looked, he had a white bandage on his neck.
Oh no.
That was about 3 inches by 3 inches probably. And I said, "Charlie, oh no, Charlie, did you do something bad?" And he said, "I can't live with what I've done to her. I killed my princess. I took the person I love the most in the world out of my life, out of this world, and I can't live with it. I don't want to live like this." So when they handed out razors this morning, I got a razor and I just took the razor blade out of it, and when the guard walked out of sight, then I just took the razor and slit my throat.
Oh, wow.
I almost got it done. I'd passed out when the guards found me and they rushed me up to the hospital. But the ER doctor at the hospital said I had missed my carotid artery by like a millimeter. Otherwise, I would have had it done. And I was really surprised that I really cared. Like, all of a sudden, this guy whom I didn't care if they executed him my first day, my first week of working with him, my first couple of weeks. All of a sudden, I care. And now I'm trying to figure out, man, what can I do? How can I help so that Charlie wants to live? So I started saying, well, Charlie, you know, your company loves you and you have so many great qualities. You can help, you can teach all these other inmates. You can teach them the skills that you have. You can change lives. These guys would really look up to you. And he would tell me, I don't relate to these people. These are not my people. We don't talk. These guys don't want to talk to me. I'm older. I live in a different world. I don't have any tattoos. It's just not I just don't relate with them. And no matter what I said, he wouldn't relate to it. And I was so frustrated because I didn't know what I could do to help him want to live. And I couldn't believe that I found myself even in that spot.
Yeah.
I remember telling his lawyer that he had attempted suicide again, and I thought he would be as upset by it as I was because he didn't believe in the death penalty. So I thought, well, he'll be happy to know he didn't do it, but he'll be worried about him like I am. And it didn't feel like he was worried. It didn't even feel like he cared. I don't know if he was just too busy, but he's like, oh yeah, they do that. Well, I hadn't had that experience, so it was very troubling for me. And about a week after that, I got a call from the lawyer saying, hey, guess what? We got a plea offer. And the offer was amazing. It was taking the death penalty off the table, and he would plead to murder, but he would get 6 years to life. Man, to go from the death penalty to 6 years to life, I was ecstatic. I was so excited. I thought, man, I cannot wait to go tell Charlie. Let's go tell him. And Jack and the other investigator and I, the three of us went to jail to tell him. Man, we were practically like giddy with excitement that we got this deal on the way there. And I was joking with them like we were so excited. I said, I could just skip down the halls with you guys. I'm so excited about this. And he said, yeah, me too. Let's do it.
Charlie said that?
No, the lawyer and the other investigator. That we were so excited that we'd saved this guy's life. And I was telling him, like, hey, there's so much. Charlie had so many skills. He helped. There were so many engineers and construction guys that he worked with that said they wouldn't be in the job they're in without Charlie. He could make a huge difference for these guys in prison that are going to be getting out soon, and that he could help them to teach them how to work. And hey, this is how you handle it in a situation. And his lawyer was like, yeah, and you know, there are a lot of things we can do. So when we got into jail, as we start down the hallway, Jack turns to me and says, hey, I thought we were going to skip. And I was like, he is about the most masculine guy I know. And I said, yeah, I really wanted to. I didn't think you really would. And the three of us, the lawyer, the investigator, and I, locked arms and skipped to Charlie's pod. Now, I don't want you to think for a minute that meant we weren't sad about what had happened, about what our client had done, what had happened to his young, beautiful wife. But amidst all that darkness and heaviness, it just brought me this little bit of sunshine, just a little bit of light into my soul, and it made me smile. When we got in to tell Charlie about the deal, I thought he would at least smile. Man, he didn't even smile. He's like, oh, okay, thank you. But, you know, I didn't want to live. Like, there's nothing to live for. And his lawyer said, well, yeah, like, there is. You know what I would like you to do? I want you to write a book that tells the judges out there to be careful about these rulings that they make, because these are real people's lives. That judge, when he made that ruling, it set you off, put you on a path that got you in this place. And if these judges were more thoughtful, they would change the way things work out. And I was like, yeah, Charlie, like, you could make a difference there. You can make a difference. And I just didn't feel he was excited about any of it. And I really was hopeful that he would be like, hey, yeah, I have a second chance at life. But he said, and he meant it, he didn't want to live with what he'd done to her. I've never had a client so sorry ever in my life. After that, we had to go to court to do a change of plea hearing, where we have to change from a not guilty plea where we're going to trial to say we're guilty, and we've already kind of worked out the sentence with the prosecutor, and hopefully the judge would agree. And we did that. We got it on the record. Her brother was there in court, and Charlie actually turned to him and apologized with tears just rolling down his face. It was a really emotional thing, and said, "I'm sorry, I can never take back what I did." And afterwards, the media surrounded the brother and said, did you accept his apology? And he said, I hope he's sincere. I'm not ready to forgive him. I hope we can get there. And I don't blame any of these people for where they are with any of it. I don't blame him.
No, not at all.
This is as serious as life can get, to have someone take the life of someone you love. So I'm not judging the brother's response or any of that. As I was walking out of the courthouse, though, this woman approached me, and I didn't know her. And she said, "Hey, are you Pamela?" "Yeah, I am." "Do I know you?" And she said, "I am Charlie's caseworker, and I'm really concerned about Charlie once he gets to prison, because when you first get to prison, they do like this 30-day evaluation where they can't have their books, they can't have anything. They just are evaluating to figure out where they belong in the prison." And she said, "I'm really worried because if Charlie can't talk to you anymore, you've been a real support to him. If he doesn't have you to talk to express and go through all of this, and he doesn't have his books, I'm really concerned that Charlie will kill himself."
Yes.
And I said, "Oh yeah, me too. I'm very concerned." And I said, I'm going to make sure I go see Charlie. This is more than just a case to me. This is a real person. This is a real life, and I've learned a lot from this. There was a lot of growth that came from me on this case. And so I said, yeah, when you talk to him, tell him I'm going to come and see him again. This isn't just about getting paid. I'm concerned. I care about him.
Yes.
Charlie got sent to prison, and they did the evaluation. They got him in his cell, wherever he belonged in the prison. And I said to my parents one day, I need to go see Charlie. I promised him that I'd keep in touch with him. But it was so hard to make time for that.
Yeah.
And it takes me an hour driving time to get there and back, and you got to check in to the warden, and
Sure.
It's not a good excuse, but I hadn't done it. And literally like 2 days after I had that conversation, mentioned it to my parents, I'm driving along and I hear on the radio this public announcement comes on that Charlie had killed himself at the Utah State Prison.
Oh, no.
And I was really surprised how much that hurt. I pulled my car over and just let the tears just roll down my face. Charlie, I'd learned a lot from him. That, those first impressions that we make of people.
Yeah.
That's not who they are.
Yeah.
And thankfully I was able to stick with it enough to learn that there was a real person in there with real feelings and remorse and regret and love and a lot of anger and frustration. But I could relate to all of those emotions. I just couldn't relate to how he expressed it. I learned a lot, and for that I'm very grateful for Charlie. And hopefully I learned better to not follow those first impressions. Thank you for listening to Pamela Private Eye, the Sorry Charlie episode.